Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. This time we are going to be looking at Mortal Kombat Games of Death by David Church. The first thing in this book that I wanted to talk about that I think David does an excellent job of really explaining are the movies that inspired Mortal Kombat, or could have inspired Mortal Kombat, and honestly other fighting games as well. I feel like it's pretty well known that Bloodsport was one of the inspirations for Mortal Kombat. Midway wanted to make a Universal Soldier game and wanted to use Jean-Claude Van Damme in their fighting game. When he wasn't available or interested, the sources I've read have been kind of back and forth on that. But also the potential license for Universal Soldier fell through. The team switched to making Mortal Kombat. Midway saw the success of Street Fighter II, and they wanted to cash in on the popularity of fighting games. Instead of going with the hand-drawn sprites route that Street Fighter II used, they went with digitized actors. They also added brutal finishing moves, and they created a compelling story to help this game stand out. Martial arts movies in the 70s and 80s were a big inspiration for Mortal Kombat. Church goes into the details of the history of martial arts movies, specifically the industry in Japan and in China. It's an exhaustive history, but it gives you an excellent place to start if you want to look more into that. Bruce Lee movies are the more prominent focus here. He explains how they relate to Mortal Kombat, and it adds a bunch of movies to my late night watching list. I hadn't heard of Game of Death before, but I can see how it probably inspired Mortal Kombat, and also Bloodsport, and even a few other video games like Kung Fu. It also might have inspired Frank Dukes, the guy who gave his fictional life story to the directors of Bloodsport, to kind of make up bullshit and make himself sound more important than he really was. This part of the book was really terrific because it explained a lot of what's in Mortal Kombat, from the special moves being inspired by Wu Ji films, and also just the characters being inspired by different actors and different people in martial arts movies, like Liu Kang being Bruce Lee, Johnny Cage being a version of Jean-Claude Van Damme. It was really cool to go through and read all of that, and also read where certain things could have been inspirations for other characters. He doesn't outright say they were, but he kind of points you in that direction. It's pretty awesome to read. His talk about the ESRB was probably my favorite part of this book. These moral panics about video games are some of my favorite parts of video game history, and reading what Church found has shed a lot of light on several interesting things that I hadn't really heard about before or hadn't heard really explained in great detail before. Mostly he talks about the messaging that went into the hearing. It isn't called this in the book, but I associate it with how political parties or corporations or interest groups would get a particular message out into the media in order to try to control the narrative and sway public opinion. While reading this, I felt that a narrative was kind of being created, not necessarily by Church, but by the people who wanted the senators to come to the conclusion that they had already came to, that video game violence was bad for people, and particularly it was bad for children. They also wanted the government to regulate it. And it's kind of interesting to read about how they created that narrative, laid it out for the senators, and the senators who already agreed with them came to that conclusion as well. The big thing for me was how the hearing didn't invite third-party developers. At least that's the way I read it from what Church had written out here. I could be reading it wrong, but that was kind of the impression that I got from this. The senators also didn't seem to draw a distinction between the console manufacturers and the people who were actually making the games. These are people like, Nintendo and Sega, who are the console manufacturers, and then companies like Sony at the time, Konami, Capcom, those people who were making the actual video games and just sending them off to be published or were putting them on cartridges. It's often overlooked in some of the YouTube videos that I've watched and some of the other books that I've read this is something that was overlooked in several of the YouTube videos that I watched and also in the books that I've read about the hearings. I don't remember them touching on this, and it was kind of interesting to see that when I read this book and then went and watched a part of the hearing. He does bring up how Nintendo stacked the deck against Sega, but he also mentions how 3 games at the heart of the hearing were presented without context. The senators and the people testifying against video games also misrepresented the footage in those games, so you were under the impression that you were killing the girls in Night Trap instead of trying to save them. Church also talks about the arcade roots of Mortal Kombat and Lethal Enforcers, and those had been overlooked in the hearing. The arcade games didn't receive much scrutiny when they came out, and it was only once they were brought into the home that they kind of became problematic. And this is a big thing that doesn't really get mentioned a whole lot, how these hearings were started because of the home console ports, and not because of the arcade violence. A lot of people drew a distinction where the arcades were still those seedy places that small cities and maybe parts of the country wanted to ban them, but they were not seen as bringing that violence into the home. Even when you had arcade games previously brought into the home, those were not necessarily scrutinized as much. It was really only when Mortal Kombat and some other games came into home consoles that they received that kind of scrutiny. One of the fun things about a book like this is when you read it, you kind of get several ideas for things to research and potentially write about. There were several exciting stories in this book. The ESRB was one of them, but also the lawsuit between Capcom and Data East was another fun one that I wanted to look into. It's a really fun book to read, and there's a whole lot of information in here, even though the book is rather short. There wasn't anything specifically that I did not like in this book. I thought it was fine, but it was not as detailed as David Craddock's book on Mortal Kombat. And that's because they're kind of speaking to 2 different audiences. Church was speaking more to the academics and the study of video games, where Craddock was talking about the history of those games and kind of the fandom. So you had 2 different audiences for those books. Church brings up some things on the Senate hearings in 1993 that I really hadn't heard talked about before, and he talks more about the history of kung fu movies that inspired Mortal Kombat. So I like that those 2 things were in here, and they were kind of lacking in Craddock's book when he wrote that. Specifically talking about the different movies that played a role in the inspirations for Mortal Kombat, I thought was really interesting. And it was also very interesting when he talked about how they have parallels to other video games as well. That was part of this book that I found just incredibly interesting. There wasn't much else that I really liked about it. Again, it's not a very long book, and there is a lot of great information in here, but there wasn't a whole lot that I can point to and say, this is one thing that I like more than something else, aside from the ESRB hearing and also kung fu movies. I can't really find anything that I didn't like, but yeah, I can probably just move on from here. This isn't a bad book by any means. In fact, I think it is the best book from the Landmark video game series that I've read. The others are fine, This one I think is more of a landmark than some of the books that were in this series, or at least the books about video games in this series. Anyway, let's move on to my final thoughts, and we'll wrap this whole thing up. Mortal Kombat's history is something that I've read quite a bit about. I could recount parts of this history from memory at times, and it's connected with so many other stories about video game history that even when you're not directly reading about the game series, you still find some accounts of history that will include Mortal Kombat as well. It's one of those iconic games that gave a shot in the arm to the arcade industry in the early 90s, and it helped Street Fighter II to really elevate the fighting game community. Church does take this story in some new directions, and he adds to the knowledge of the game. His book is an excellent overview of several parts of Mortal Kombat's history. However, it doesn't really dig deep enough for me. While there are several interesting things that I hadn't really thought about before in here, there is a lot of what I already knew. In many ways, this feels like how I felt when I read a book about Super Mario 2. I'm glad I read both of these books, but I would have liked it more if I had read them a few years earlier, when I didn't really know too much about the history behind those games. I think it's a very good book. It's probably one of the better books from the Landmark video game series. It at least is a Landmark video game, so you don't have to read through, 20 to 30 pages of the authors trying to convince you that this game matters, like what happened with the Tempest book, where that game is not really a Landmark video game. And I'm sorry to all those Tempest fans out there, but it really isn't. Mortal Kombat is one of those games that really did a lot for video game history, and I think Church does a good job of kind of laying that out for you and for the reader. Anyway, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments below, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.